Hey everyone, in this video lecture, we will be covering the topic of macromolecules. These are also known as organic molecules or biomolecules. All of these terms are referring to the same thing. In this video, I will be referring to them as macromolecules. So before getting into the logistics of what a macromolecule is, we need to go back and think about that in the study of biology, we're looking at life, and life itself is very organized. So when we're talking about life being organized, we're talking how the most basic unit of a living organism is a single cell. And we can get cells combining together, specific types of cells forming tissues. And that when you have certain tissues working together, you can get organs. And then we can start scaling up. And when a bunch of different organs work together, we have an organ system like the circulatory system. And then, eventually once all these organ systems work together, we have one single entire organism. But when we take that cell and actually go back and look at the even more simplistic components of a cell, we're looking at cells are made up of molecules. And molecules are made up of a bunch of atoms. Atoms being the most basic component of life, if you will. And so when we have multiple different atoms coming together, we get these molecules. And all living things have to be made up of these atoms. And so what we're going to be looking at are the atoms that are combining to make these bigger molecules that are the main components within cells. So that's where we get the molecules of life, which we call them macromolecules, we call them biomolecules, or we call them organic molecules. I like the phrase macromolecule to remind us that they are molecules, meaning they're made up of atoms combined together, but macro meaning these molecules are quite large. And there are four molecules that are necessary for all of life. We have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So throughout this video, we'll walk through each of these and talk about the structure of them, examples of them, and what their function or job is to do within a cell. Now, one basic structural thing when it comes to these macromolecules, again, macro meaning that they're really large molecules, we refer to these large molecules as polymers. And the reason we refer to them as polymers is because they're made up of many repeating subunits called monomers. And so if we break down the word monomer and polymer, monomer, the root mono means one in Latin. And so when we have many of these little single subunits that are monomers combining together, they're repeating over and over again, we get a larger molecule called a polymer, where poly in Latin means many. So many monomers come together to form these larger polymers. So most of these macromolecules have this repeating subunit structure where you have monomers combining to form polymers. As we go through this video, my students have this graphic organizer in front of them, so it's important that you are going to be filling this out for each of the different macromolecules. Tell me what its function is, what its job is to do within the cell, the types of atoms or elements that make up each of these macromolecules, what is the structure, so what is the monomer polymer for this particular molecule, as well as some examples, things that are each of these biomolecules. And so around my classroom, you're going to find the posters that are up around the room. As you walk around the room, find each poster, fill out those notes on your graphic organizer. So when it comes to our carbohydrates, so the atoms that make up carbohydrates, we use the acronym CHO to remember it, which means that carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. And what's unique about carbohydrates is that the combination of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms always falls in this 1:1 ratio. So for example, glucose is a carbohydrate. It's made up of 6 carbon atoms. It's made up of 12 hydrogen atoms and 6 oxygen atoms. So if we were to reduce that into a simple ratio, it would be 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogen for every 1 oxygen. So all carbohydrates fall in this 1:1 ratio. And again, the only atoms that make it up are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The function of a carbohydrate is to be a quick source of energy within a cell. And later on in this video series, you will learn about cellular respiration, looking at how we can take a carbohydrate and actually get cellular energy from it. And a kind of secondary structure or function of our carbohydrates is providing both structure and support within cells. Within plant cells in particular, there are carbohydrates that help give the organism, the cells, more structure to it, more support compared to cells without it. So the basic structure of a carbohydrate, the monomer polymer setup here, the monomer we call monosaccharides. So again, mono meaning single or one, and saccharide refers to sugar in Latin. So when we're talking about the monomer of carbohydrates, no matter what carbohydrate we're looking at a simple sugar ring that makes up the repeating subunit of a carbohydrate. Now that simple sugar could be different depending on which carbohydrate we're looking at. So in this example, this one sugar ring represents a glucose. And then the polymer is what we call a polysaccharide, or poly referring to many and saccharide referring to sugar. So many sugar rings connected. So in this particular carbohydrate, we're looking at many of these glucose rings repeating over and over and over again. Now, the monomer and polymer exactly might differ depending on which carb we're looking at, but that basic structure of a simple sugar ring repeating over and over again fits for carbohydrates. In terms of examples, so in biology, when we see words ending with the letters OSE, you know that you're most likely dealing with a carbohydrate. So for example, glucose, cellulose, sucrose, these are all words that end in OSE and are carbohydrates. And these things also happen to be sugars. So carbs are your sugars, as well as starches, which are more complex sugars. There's just more atoms bonding together to make it so that they're not just those simple little sugar rings that we saw in that last slide. When the next macromolecule or molecule of life are our lipids, and the atoms that make up lipids is very similar to carbohydrates. Again, it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But note here that we're not dealing with a 1-to-1 ratio this time, and that lipids are mostly carbon and hydrogen with very little oxygen. Whereas in the last example with the carbs, there was quite a bit of oxygen. This is mostly just carbon and hydrogen atoms. In terms of the function, it's also very similar to carbohydrates, but in this time, we're dealing with energy in the cell, but lipids act as a more long-term energy source. We store that energy in the form of fat, and when we're lacking that carbohydrate energy, we'll switch over to burning fat to get a different source of energy for our cells. A secondary function that's also just as important is that lipids are a main component of cell membranes, so they're important for allowing things in or out of our cells. In terms of structure, the monomer polymer here, this one doesn't fit the best to the monomer polymer setup, but if we were to kind of make it fit, the monomer of most lipids are these fatty acid tails, if you will. So there's these long little chains of carbon and hydrogen atoms stuck together. And so that is what you see in this picture in green, the little fatty acid tails. There happens to be 3 monomers or 3 repeating fatty acid chains. And then the polymer would be the whole molecule here, which in this case, this particular example we're looking at has this glycerol head to it, as well as its fatty acid tails. So all lipids have that kind of head-tail structure. So it's not quite repeating subunits. There are the fatty acids, and there's also this secondary molecule, the glycerol here. So examples, the one that I mentioned earlier about how lipids make up cell membranes, your phospholipids, they're a particular type of lipid responsible or that make up cell membranes. Anything that is deemed a fat or things that have lots of fat in it, the fat are lipids, oils fall into fats, waxes, as well as steroids are all different types of lipids. And they would have slightly different structures depending on which type of lipid we're looking at. All right, so the second to last of our Macromolecules are proteins, and the atoms that make up proteins this time are different than the other two macromolecules. So we still have carbon, we still have hydrogen, we still have oxygen, but now we also have nitrogen and sulfur. And I put a note here that sulfur is only in certain proteins. It's not always going to be there depending on the type of protein we're dealing with, but we still see that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. In terms of their function, there's so many different functions of proteins. One of the bigger functions or bigger jobs of proteins is to help control the speed of certain chemical reactions inside of cells. Basically, if proteins didn't exist, these chemical reactions would never happen or would happen way too slowly within the cell. So these proteins will help force chemical reactions along. They do help provide structure. They transport things throughout cells. And there's just many, many, many more functions. But these three are the biggest, most important functions of proteins within a cell. Their structure does follow the typical monomer-polymer setup. So the monomer for proteins are called amino acids. There are over 20 different amino acid monomers that exist. And depending on the combination, the order of these different monomers or different amino acids would give us our different polymer or a different type of protein. And we call the polymer here, we call it a polypeptide. So poly again meaning many, peptide referring to the peptide bond that is holding these amino acids together. So polypeptide just is referencing that many different amino acids are held together by those peptide bonds. But again, depending on the combination of the amino acids that join together, we would be looking at different types of proteins themselves. They would each have a different name. Some examples of proteins, there are all different kinds of proteins, hundreds and hundreds of, or if not thousands and thousands of different proteins in cells. So there's lots of different types of enzymes. So enzymes, a class of proteins. These are the ones responsible for speeding up or making chemical reactions happen within the cell. Some ones that we'll probably talk about throughout this video series is hemoglobin. It's a protein found in your blood. We'll talk about antibodies. These are types of proteins that help an immune response. And then keratin might be one that you're familiar with. It's a protein found in skin, hair, and nails. But you'll notice that not all, but some of these proteins end with the letters IN. So that's also a good indicator that you're looking at a protein. So the last of our macromolecules are our nucleic acids. In the atoms that make up nucleic acids, we see again carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. We again have nitrogen with our nucleic acids, and then the addition of phosphorus. So if we were to put all the different atoms that we're talking about throughout all four molecules, the acronym to remember is CHOMPS. Especially that carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are definitely the three most important atoms or elements for life. Nitrogen up there as well, and then the phosphorus and sulfur are each kind of singleton. They're only found in one particular macromolecule. The function of our nucleic acids, they're responsible for storing genetic information within a cell, as well as helping build the proteins. So throughout this course, we'll do a whole unit wrapping around how nucleic acids store genetic information, how they are responsible for building proteins within a cell. In terms of the structure, the monomer for a nucleic acid, it has a very, very similar name. It's called a nucleotide. And nucleotides have a basic three-part structure where they have a little sugar ring. It has a little phosphate group attached to it, and then it has these nitrogenous bases that could be different depending on which nucleotide we're dealing with. So this one has the A or adenine base. There's the T or thymine, cytosine, or guanine bases that could be in this position. And so depending on which nucleotides we're dealing with, we could be looking at a polymer of DNA or a polymer of RNA. And again, later on this year, we'll talk about the differences between DNA and RNA. But for now, again, DNA or RNA are repeating subunits of those nucleotides to coming together to form that larger molecule. And there are the only two examples for nucleic acids are the DNA or RNA. There's no other examples out there. So those polymers are the examples. All right, so that is your 4 macromolecules. These are the molecules of life. So make sure that you study and review them because they are a bit complicated and there is just a lot to know about each and every one of them. So thanks for watching, and make sure to leave comments if you have any questions.